For someone. Chapter 1. The Garden. The roses came in first in May, as they always did. They came before the peonies on Alderton Street, before the wisteria that draped itself over the Kowalski porch, 2 doors down, before any flower, in any garden for a radius of at least 6 blocks in every direction, which was not a competition, exactly, but which was noticed, because things like that are always noticed in neighborhoods where people have time to pay attention to the quality of one another's gardens. The roses on Alderton Street were a category unto themselves. They were the kind of roses that made people slow down on the pavement, without quite meaning to, the way you slow without meaning to, when you hear music coming from an open window. They drew the eye and held it. They were deeply, impractically beautiful. The man who grew them was named Soren. He was 61 years old, though he looked, depending on the light and his mood, anywhere from 55 to something older and harder to name. He was tall, with the kind of posture that comes not from vanity, but from habit, from years of standing over a garden bed, from the specific muscular memory of a man who has bent and straightened 10,000 times, and learned, at some point, to straighten fully. His hair had gone silver in his early 50s and he had not minded. His hands were the hands of someone who worked outdoors, thick-knuckled, patient, permanently faintly stained at the cuticles, despite the scrubbing. He had lived in the house on Alderton Street for 31 years. He had grown roses in the front garden for 26 of them. The sign had been there for 5. It was not a large sign. It was a piece of reclaimed wood, the kind you find at the back of a hardware shop. Already weathered, already honest with letters, he had painted himself in a careful, unhurried hand. The paint was a dark green, close to the color of the leaves. The letters said, "For those who have someone to give them to." And below the sign, on a small hook screwed into the fence post, hung a pair of scissors. Good ones, not the flimsy kind that come in a stationery pack, but proper florist's scissors, the blades angled, the handles worn smooth. He replaced them every winter. He oiled them in the autumn when he oiled the gate, hinges and the trowel handles and everything else in the shed that was worth maintaining. People had asked him about the sign, of course. People always asked. The woman from the coffee shop on the corner, Amelia, small and precise and perpetually curious, had stopped one morning with her takeaway cup and said, "Soren, why won't you just pick them yourself? You could sell them. You could bring them inside." He had looked at her for a moment, with the particular expression he wore when he was considering how much of an answer to give, and then he had said, "They look better out here." Which was true, and which was also not quite the whole of it. The whole of it was more complicated, and he kept it, as he kept most things, in the interior of himself, where it was available for examination on quiet evenings, but not on offer to the general public. Every morning before 7, while the neighborhood was still finding its feet, Soren came out in his garden boots and his old waxed jacket and walked the length of the rose beds. He dead-headed where necessary. He checked for aphids. He pressed the soil at the base of each plant with 2 fingers, the way you might press a pulse point, reading the moisture level with a precision that had taken years to develop. and which he could no longer have explained in words. He talked to the roses, sometimes, not in full sentences, more in the low murmuring sound a person makes when they are concentrating and comfortable, a sound he was barely aware of making. Then he went inside and made coffee and read the paper, and did not think, consciously, about the scissors on the fence. But he was aware of them. He was always aware of them. In the way you are aware of a thing you have left out, deliberately, not with anxiety, but with a low, attentive readiness, the way a shopkeeper is aware of the door, even when their back is turned. He was waiting, without admitting he was waiting, for whoever came next. Chapter 2. The Stories. The first one that particular May was a young man named Felix. He was perhaps 25, with the slightly dazed expression of someone who has recently and unexpectedly found himself in love and has not yet decided how to carry it. He came on a Saturday morning when the street was still quiet, stood in front of the rose beds for a long time. With his hands in his jacket pockets, read the sign, read it again, and then looking up and down the pavement with the instinctive self-consciousness of someone about to do something that felt significant. Reached for the scissors. Soren watched from the front window. He did not watch in the way of someone surveilling. He watched in the way of someone who genuinely wants to see what happens next, who finds, in these small transactions between strangers and his garden, something he cannot quite name but which feels necessary. Felix cut 3 roses. He cut them carefully, at the correct angle, with the hesitance of someone who had perhaps looked up how to do this, and was now trying to remember. He held them in his fist like something fragile, and walked back up the street, with the particular walk of a person who is going somewhere important, and is keeping themselves from running. Soren set down his coffee. 3 roses. Red ones. He had 4 varieties, but the reds came in first and the young always went for the reds, which was not a criticism but an observation. The kind of observation you accumulate over 5 years of watching. The reds meant new love, or love recently declared, or love still, in the stage where you reach for the most obvious symbol, because the obvious symbol is what the feeling calls for before language catches up with it. He thought about what it was like to feel that. To have somewhere to go with 3 red roses in your fist on a Saturday morning. The whole day stretched ahead of you and someone at the end of it. He thought about it only briefly. Then he went to make a second cup of coffee. The boy came in June, on a school day, which meant he was either very ill or very truant. He was perhaps 14, lanky in the way of boys that age all sudden height, and not enough weight to justify it yet, with a look on his face that Soren recognized without needing to be told what it meant. Not romantic trouble. Something older. Something he was carrying home to someone. He stood at the fence for a long time without touching the scissors. He read the sign several times, then he sat down on the low wall, opposite the garden, and put his head in his hands, and stayed that way for a while. Soren went to the door. He did not intrude. He opened the door and stood just inside the threshold, not fully visible, and said, "There's water, if you're thirsty." The boy looked up. He had been crying, which he was now trying to disguise in the efficient, furious way of 14-year-olds, scrubbing his face with his sleeve. He said, "I'm fine." "All right," Soren said. A pause. "The yellow ones are good," Soren said. "If you're going to someone who needs cheering up. The yellow ones are for well. They're not for romance. They're for other things." The boy looked at the roses. He looked at the sign. Something shifted in his face, not quite resolution, but the beginning of it, the way a key moves in a lock before the tumbler's catch. He stood up. He took the scissors. He cut 2 yellow roses with a kind of determined inexpertness, the stems slightly too long, the angle approximate, and put them under his arm and said, without looking at Soren, "My mum's in hospital." "Ah," Soren said. "She's going to be okay. They said she's going to be okay." "Good," Soren said. "That's good." The boy went. Soren watched him walk up the street, the yellow roses bobbing slightly with each long stride, slightly too long-stemmed, approximate, entirely right. He stood on the doorstep for a moment after the boy had turned the corner. Then he went back inside. The woman in the blue coat came in late June, on a weekday afternoon. She was around 40, dark-haired, with the kind of composure that sits on top of something less composed. The way ice sits on water, you can see the movement underneath if the light is right. She had been driving past. It seemed her car was parked halfway up the curb, with the hazard lights blinking, the haphazard parking of someone who has stopped on an impulse, and is not sure how long they're staying. She stood at the fence for a long time. She did not reach for the scissors. She read the sign. She read it again. She looked at the roses with an expression Soren could not easily categorize, not longing, not exactly. Something more specific. Something that had a name but not a comfortable one. After a while she turned, and went back to the car and drove away without cutting anything. Soren watched her go. He found, sometimes, that the ones who didn't take a rose told him as much as the ones who did. The sign said for those who have someone to give them to, and occasionally a person stood in front of it, and read it and understood, with whatever quiet clarity they had access to that day, that they did not, just at this moment, have someone. Or that they had someone but the rose would not do. Or that they had once had someone and the distance between that tense. And this one was, on a Wednesday afternoon in June, too much to negotiate. He didn't know which of these it was for the woman in the blue coat. He would not know. She drove away and he never saw her again. And that was, in its own way, part of it, the not knowing. The partial glimpse. The sense of other people's lives as things you see through moving windows. That evening he watered the beds and thought, without meaning to, about tenses. The past tense of having someone. The curious grammar of that how had feels so different from have, even when the love itself has not diminished. Even when what you carry is not smaller for being old. Chapter 3. The Apology. Her name was Jade. She came on a Sunday in July, in the middle of the afternoon, when the heat sat heavy over the street and the pavement shimmered faintly and most sensible people were indoors or in gardens of their own. She came on foot, from the direction of the bus stop, wearing sandals and a printed dress and the expression of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to do several times, and is now hoping the rehearsal holds. She was perhaps 30, perhaps a little older. She had, Soren observed, the look of someone in the middle of a story rather than at the beginning or end of one, the particular tension of unresolved things. She read the sign. She picked up the scissors. She held them for a moment without cutting anything, turning them over in her hand. Then she looked up. Soren was in the garden, ostensibly deadheading, which he was doing with somewhat less attention than usual. "Excuse me," Jade said. "Can I ask, do you have anything in pink?" He looked at the beds. "The climbers on the right," he said. "The light pink ones, those are the most they're the softest." "Soft," she repeated, as though testing the word. "Good for when you need something that isn't quite saying one thing or another," Soren said. "Not red. Not yellow. Something in between." She looked at him for a moment with an evaluating expression. "Are you a florist?" "No. Just someone who's thought about it." She turned to the climbers and cut 4 of the light pink roses with more confidence than Felix had managed and less desperation than the boy. 4 was a deliberate number. She held them and looked at them for a while. "I said something terrible to my sister," she said, to the roses rather than to Soren. "Not terrible in the eye, didn't shout. I said something true that I should have kept to myself. Or said differently. Or said in a completely different year when she was better equipped to hear it." Soren waited. "I don't know if flowers fix that," she said. "They don't," he said. "But they say you're standing on her doorstep, which is the part that matters." Jade considered this. She might not open the door, she might not, he agreed. She looked at the roses again. Something settled in her face, not resolution, but something like it. The acceptance that you go anyway. That you stand on the doorstep with your approximate offering and you wait, and either the door opens or it doesn't. And either way you have shown up, which is the only thing that was ever really in your control. "Thank you," she said. "For the roses. And for the conversation. Good luck," Soren said. She went. He watched her walk back toward the bus stop, the 4 pink roses held loosely at her side, swaying slightly. She had good posture. The walk of someone who had made a decision. He thought about apologies. The specific difficulty of them, not the saying sorry part, which is hard enough, but the part before, the part where you have to decide whether you are going to try. Whether the relationship is worth the exposure. Whether you can stand the possibility of the door staying shut. He thought about a particular door that had, many years ago, stayed shut. Not because of anything as simple as an argument. Because of something quieter, more incremental, more complete. He went inside and started dinner and did not think about it for the rest of the evening, mostly. Chapter 4. Amelia's Question. The summer wore on and the roses kept coming. A man in his 50s, grey at the temples, good shoes, the look of someone who had been carefully putting something off, came and cut a single white rose one morning and walked to his car with it held at arm's length, the way you carry something you're afraid of dropping. A young woman came with a friend, and they stood together, giggling at the sign and then went quiet together and cut 2 flowers each and went quiet in 2 different ways, which told Soren 2 different things about 2 different situations, neither of which he would ever know the full story of. A teenage girl came every 2 weeks for a month, always on Thursdays, always in the afternoon, and cut 1 small rose each time without explanation, and after the 3rd Thursday, Soren found he was checking, without meaning to, that the roses were looking their best by Wednesday evening. He never asked. That was the agreement, not a spoken one, but implicit in the nature of the sign, in the nature of the scissors on the hook. You did not require explanation. You did not demand the story. You made the thing available and you stepped back and let people take it or leave it according to their own needs. It was the most he felt he could offer, at this point in his life, to the general project of human connection. In September, when the roses were beginning to ease toward their last flourish before autumn, Amelia from the corner coffee shop stopped again. She came earlier than usual, before she opened up, in her work clothes and her coat, carrying her own coffee in a travel cup because the machine wasn't on yet. She leaned on the fence and looked at the garden. "They're extraordinary this year," she said. "They have been," Soren agreed. He was tying in a climber that had come loose from its trellis hook in a recent wind. "Good summer for it. I've been watching people come," Amelia said. She said it with a kind of careful neutrality, as though observing whether he would engage. "Have you?" "All sorts. There was a man a few weeks ago, older, very smart coat. He stood there for about 20 minutes before he cut anything." "The white one," Soren said. "Was it?" She paused. "Soren, can I ask you something that is perhaps not my business?" "You can ask," he said, which was not quite yes but was not no either. "Why don't you ever pick one for yourself?" He was quiet for a moment. He finished tying the climber, pressing the soft tie around the new growth with practiced lightness. "I'm not sure they're for me," he said. "You grew them." "Yes." "That doesn't disqualify you from." "I know," he said. "It's not about qualifying." Amelia watched him. She had run the coffee shop for 11 years, and had, in that time, developed the particular skill of knowing when a person was about to say something and when they were done. She waited. "The roses do more good out here," he said finally. He straightened up and looked at the beds, the late September light on them. The last of the deep reds and the blush pinks and the climbers going slightly to hip now. Which had its own beauty, the beauty of things past their peak that are still entirely themselves. They do more good for people who have somewhere to take them. "And you don't," Amelia said. Not unkindly. Not even, particularly, as a question. He looked at her. "I used to," he said. Amelia was quiet for a moment. She looked at the roses and then at the scissors on their hook and then at Soren, who had already turned back to the trellis. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. "It was a long time ago." And it was. He paused. "It was good, while it was." She left after a minute, going to open the shop, and Soren worked on in the garden alone. And the September light moved across the rose beds in the slow, sidelong way of autumn light, which has a different quality than summer light, less direct, more considered, as though it is thinking about what it touches. He was aware of the scissors on the fence. He was always aware of them. He did not pick a rose for himself. Chapter 5. Used to. It had been 22 years since Lucas died. Soren did not, as a rule, think in those terms 22 years, as though grief were measured in the way of anniversaries, in the way of official occasions. But the roses made him think in years, because the roses had begun with Lucas, which made them the single largest project of his life that had outlasted the reason for starting it, and which continued, somehow, to be the right thing. He had met Lucas when they were both 38. This is important only because by 38, you have made enough mistakes and survived enough winters and become sufficiently acquainted with your own character to understand, when you meet someone, whether they are someone. Soren had understood almost immediately. Not in the cinematic way, no thunderclap, no sudden certitude, but in the steady, accumulating way of a man who has learned to trust evidence. The evidence was Lucas remembered everything Soren said. Lucas laughed at the same things, with the same slightly delayed recognition. The laugh, that means I understood it, not just I heard it. Lucas had opinions about soil composition and the naming of colors, and the particular cruelty of the middle distance of long distances, which was also Soren's area of concern. They had lived together on Alderton Street for 14 years. Lucas had been the one who grew the roses initially. It was his project. He had come to it late, in his early 40s. With the intensity of someone who has found a thing they should have been doing all along. He grew them with a seriousness that Soren had found, at first, faintly amusing. And then, very quickly, entirely moving the way Lucas read about them, the way he corresponded with growers. 2 counties over about rootstock, the way he stood in the garden in the early morning, talking to them in the low murmuring sound of a person concentrating and comfortable. Soren had stood at the window in those mornings and watched him. This is one of the things he carries. The particular angle of Lucas in the garden at 7 in the morning, in his old jacket, talking to the roses. And on Fridays this was the practice, the one that had started as an impulse and become ritual. The way the best things do, without anyone deciding it was going to. On Fridays Lucas would come inside with his hands dirty and his face still carrying the particular calm of the garden, and he would hold out a single rose. Different ones at different times of year, different colors for different moods. Chosen with a consideration that was never spoken about and did not need to be. He had a florist's scissors, the blades angled, the handles worn smooth, and he would cut the rose at the correct angle and hold it out. Soren would take it. That was all. That was all there was to it, on the surface. But it was one of those small repeated gestures that turns out, in retrospect, to be a way of saying something that the larger language, the declarations, the arguments, the conversations that lasted into the small hours never quite managed. A rose on a Friday, handed across. A thing grown with patience and offered to someone specific. I did this for you. I made this beautiful thing and it is for you. Lucas had been ill for 3 years before he died, and during those 3 years the garden had become increasingly Soren's domain, because Lucas could not manage it. And Soren had learned everything he knew about growing roses in those years out of necessity first. and then out of love for the thing itself. And then out of a need he could not quite articulate to keep doing what Lucas had done, to maintain the garden the way Lucas had maintained it, which was also a way of maintaining something else that he could not name but could not stop tending. He kept growing them after. Obviously he kept growing them. Stopping would have been, he didn't know what stopping would have been. Smaller than he could manage. He kept growing them and the garden kept being the garden, and for a long time that was enough. Or it was not enough, but it was what there was, and what there is usually what you work with. The scissors on the fence had come later, 5 years ago. He had been standing in the garden one spring evening, watching a woman slow down on the pavement to look at the roses. The specific slowing down, the held attention, and he had felt, not for the first time, the slight absurdity of beauty kept only for itself. Beauty that could not be carried anywhere. He had gone into the shed and found Lucas's old florist's scissors and hung them on the fence the next morning with the sign he had made the night before. He had thought someone should be able to take these somewhere. He had thought, this is the best I can do with what I have left of this. It was not nothing. He knew that. He watched Felix walk up the street with his 3 red roses and the boy with his 2 yellow ones, and Jade, with her 4 pink roses held with quiet determination, and he knew it was not nothing. He watched 100 small exchanges between his garden and the world, and understood that the scissors on the fence were doing something he could not have done by keeping the roses to himself. Which was the thing that made it right, even when it also, on certain evenings, made it ache. The last roses of the season came in October, which in a good year meant flowers well into the 2nd week, sometimes the 3rd. The weather held that autumn mild and still, the light going amber and particular, the sort of October that reminds you why autumn exists. The roses came in slower, the last ones, taking their time. They were, he always thought, the best ones. Not because they were more beautiful, exactly, but because they knew they were last. It was Amelia who came, on a Thursday in October, at the end of the day. She came after closing up the shop, still in her apron, with the end-of-day look of someone who has been talking to people since 7 in the morning. And has arrived at the comfortable end of that. She leaned on the fence and looked at the last roses. "Still some left," she said. "A few more days," Soren said. He was banking up the beds against the coming cold, a task he did every autumn with a thoroughness that Lucas had once described, with characteristic precision, as a form of faith. "I've been thinking about what you said," Amelia said. "In September." He waited. "You said the roses do more good for people who have somewhere to take them." "I've been thinking about that. About the logic of it." She paused. "Can I say something that is definitely not my business?" "You can say it," he said. "I won't guarantee to answer it." She smiled slightly. "Soren, who did you use to give them to?" He was still for a moment. He pressed the soil at the base of one of the climbers with 2 fingers, reading the moisture, occupying his hands. "His name was Lucas," he said. Amelia said nothing. He had noticed over 11 years, the particular gift of knowing when silence was the right response and how long to hold it. "He grew these, originally," Soren said. "Or he started them. I took over." "How long ago?" 22. 2 years. She was quiet for a moment. Then the scissors. His, Soren said. I replace them every year, but yes. His, first. Amelia looked at the sign. She had read it hundreds of times, passing twice a day for 5 years. But she read it now with a different attention. For those who have someone to give them to. And you? She said. Not pushing. Just asking, the way you ask a question. You think you already know the answer to, because hearing the answer said aloud is different from knowing it. Soren looked at the rose beds. The last few in the October light deep red, blush pink, the pale climber trembling very slightly in the cool evening air. I used to, he said. Amelia looked at him for a long moment. Then she straightened up from the fence, and she reached for the scissors slowly, with a kind of deliberateness, and she cut one of the late roses, a dark red, careful and correct. She held it for a moment. Then she leaned over the fence and held it out to him. He looked at it. He looked at her. You grew it, she said. Someone should give it to you. He took it. He did not say anything for a moment. He held it the way you hold something you have not touched in a long time, carefully, readjusting to the weight of it, which is never quite what you remembered. Thank you, he said. Good night, Soren. She went back up the street toward the corner, and he stood in the garden in the October evening, holding the dark red rose, and the light was going amber and long, and the street was quiet, and somewhere up the road, a car started and drove away, and somewhere in the middle distance a dog barked once and was still. He stood there for a while. He thought about Lucas in the garden at 7 in the morning. He thought about Fridays. He thought about the scissors, which had been Lucas's and which he oiled every autumn and replaced every winter, and which had been used, over 5 years, by Felix and the boy and Jade. And the man with the white rose and the teenage girl on Thursdays and the woman in the blue coat, who had stood and read and put them down and walked away. And all the others, all the partial glimpses, all the small transactions between the garden and the people who came to it with their hands open and somewhere to go. He thought about what it was to grow something for someone, to tend it over years, to get up in the early morning and press the soil with 2 fingers and talk under your breath and cut and shape and maintain. To do all of that and then hold out the result impermanent, finite, already beginning its slow conclusion even as you handed it across. I did this for you. I made this beautiful thing and it is for you. He brought the rose inside. He found a glass, filled it with water, set it on the kitchen windowsill where the last of the light came through. The rose stood upright in the glass, very still, very particular, the dark red of it going almost black in the evening shadow, and then, as the last of the light caught it, going entirely, briefly, itself. He stood looking at it for a moment. Then he made dinner, and the kitchen filled with warmth, and outside on the fence, the scissors hung on their hook in the October air, and the last roses of the season moved very gently in the evening wind. And the street went on. The car doors and the distant voices, and the particular sound of a neighborhood settling toward night going on around the garden. The way the world always goes on around a thing that is quietly, stubbornly, still growing.